Thanksgiving is a day where we gather with our families and loved ones to show our appreciation for them and celebrate everything we have together. One not-so-great side of this is that when we meet up with a lot of family members who we don't tend to see much throughout the year, arguments and slight conflicts can sometimes take place. Normally, though, these entail just having an uncomfortable back and forth with that uncle or aunt who doesn't see eye to eye with you politically, or really loves that sports team you can't stand. Most of the time, these arguments end as quickly as they began, and everyone goes back to having a good time with one another. However, this isn't always the case, and in 2009, one family saw their Thanksgiving go from a day of celebration to an absolute nightmare. On Thanksgiving Day 2009, police were called to the home of Muriel and Jim Sitton, where a massacre had taken place that left 4 people lying dead. Among the victims were 33-year-old Carla Marriage, 33-year-old Lisa Knight, 79-year-old Ramonde Joseph, and most tragic of all, Jim and Muriel's 6-year-old daughter, Michaela. Several others in attendance had been wounded, with the worst of them being Lisa's husband, Patrick Knight, who would survive his injuries but would spend 3 months in a medically induced coma. Police spoke with the survivors as paramedics arrived and were told a horrific tale. The day had begun as peaceful and happy as one could ask. This year, the Sittons were hosting 16 of their immediate and extended family at their upscale home in Jupiter, Florida. Shortly after everyone had arrived, Michael Marriage, Muriel's uncle and father of Lisa and Carla, informed everyone that his son Paul Merhige had called and was on his way over to the home. This announcement caught everyone off guard, as Paul had something of a troubled history with his family. Growing up, he had been a promising child, an honor student who had earned nothing but straight A's in school and had set his sights on becoming a doctor after graduating. However, something went terribly wrong in the years after Paul left high school. He began to exhibit very violent and aggressive behavior, as well as severe emotional instability. This made it almost impossible for him to hold down a job or socialize well enough to be able to get into a decent college and pursue his medical school dreams. By 1994, at the age of 20, he had become almost entirely dependent on his parents for financial support, and 2 years later would be declared legally disabled. Paul lived with his parents for the next 12 years, which would prove to be a tumultuous period for the family. His violent and aggressive behavior seemed to only worsen during this time, as he was involuntarily committed to a psychiatric ward on 3 separate occasions, and police were often called to his parents' home to deal with domestic incidents. These included Paul threatening his parents with a gun, threatening and in one case even attempting suicide, as well as a laundry list of other events. Paul's relationship with his sisters, Lisa and Carla, also quickly began to unravel. He seemed to blame his lack of success in life on them, and was apparently jealous of their ability to live a normal life while he was trapped in his own mental hell. He would make threatening remarks toward them that eventually became so bad Lisa filed a restraining order against him, though this was later revoked. By 2006, Paul's parents could no longer deal with his behavior. They purchased a condo for him to live in and hired a housekeeper to not only look after the place, but keep track of whether or not Paul was taking his psychiatric medication. Because of all this, Paul had become something of a black sheep in the family. In fact, the previous Thanksgiving's host had informed Paul's parents that they would not be welcome if they tried bringing their son with them. Despite this and the litany of red flags that he had seen throughout his life, Paul's father accepted his son's phone call that day and gave him directions to the Sittons' home without ever asking anyone else if it was okay. In a horrifically ironic statement, Paul's mother turned to his sister Lisa upon hearing Paul was on the way and jokingly said, quote, "I hope he doesn't kill us all." Paul arrived at the Sittons' home, and to everyone's surprise, Things went peacefully. They had dinner, shared stories, and later Carla played piano and sang Christmas carols with their aunt and mother while Michaela showed off a dance she was going to be performing in a play the next evening. Tragically, this was nothing more than the calm before the storm. After Michaela went to bed, Paul excused himself and went out to his car. When he returned, he pulled a handgun out without warning and began firing at his family. First, he shot his 79-year-old aunt, Mrs. Joseph, killing her instantly. He then turned and fired at both his sisters, Carla and Lisa, fatally wounding them, and then shot Lisa's husband, Patrick, as he kneeled down to check on his wife, though he would survive his injuries. By this point, much of the other family members had run for cover, with the Sittons taking cover in their kitchen and quickly calling 911. Tragically, they did not notice Paul walking down the hallway and into Michaela's room, where he fired 3 shots into the sleeping child, killing her instantly just days before what would have been her 7th birthday. Paul emerged from the room and walked back down the hallway, where he turned to the traumatized survivors and remarked, quote, "I've been waiting 20 years to do that," before walking out the front door, getting into his blue Toyota Camry, and driving away. It was an attack that only lasted a few minutes, but would shatter multiple families for years to come. Police initially feared that Paul had fled the state and possibly the country. A $100,000 reward was offered for information leading to Mr. Merhige's capture, and eventually the story was picked up by the popular crime show America's Most Wanted, which would prove to be Paul's undoing. The episode aired just a month after the deadly shooting, and Paul's photo was immediately recognized by Melinda Paff, who owned the Edgewater Lodge Hotel in Long Key, Florida. She swore Paul matched the description of a man named John Baca, who had been staying there for the last month. She called into the America's Most Wanted hotline and informed them she was beyond certain that the man staying at her hotel was Merhige. FBI and U.S. Marshals quickly assembled and made their way over to the hotel, where they ambushed a bewildered Paul Merhige in his room. He had shaved his head to try and disguise his appearance, but it was unmistakable who he actually was. America's Most Wanted camera crew was on scene for the arrest, and even spoke with Paul shortly after.
18 years of utter torment.
What do you mean by that?
I've had chronic medical problems, mental problems. It's been a nightmare. I didn't even know what I was doing.
During interrogation by police, Paul seemed in a daze, almost as if he didn't comprehend what he had actually done, which initially gave the impression that he was going to be angling for an insanity plea. Any hope of that would quickly fall apart, though. Not only did his actions over the years and his very own words after committing the crime indicate he had long been planning to harm his family, but investigators found that in the weeks leading up to the shooting, Paul had withdrawn $12,000 from a savings account his parents had set up for him and used some of the money to go buy guns and ammo from a local firearms store. In total, he was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, and prosecutors also announced they would be seeking the death penalty. The trial, though, would never come. In October of 2011, after over a year of delays, Paul Merhige was set to go on trial, but just a couple of weeks before it was set to begin, he accepted a plea deal from the state of Florida. Paul would plead guilty to all counts and waive his right to an appeal. In exchange, the prosecution would take the death penalty off the table, and he would spend the rest of his life in prison with no possibility of parole. The family members who had been Paul's victims were torn on this decision. Jim and Muriel Sitton, who had lost their young daughter Michaela, wanted the case to go to trial and Paul to face the death penalty. They had spent over a year preparing themselves for the trial and felt blindsided by the sudden plea deal and publicly lobbied for the case to go to trial and were supported by America's Most Wanted host John Walsh. Others, though, such as Lisa's husband Patrick Knight, simply felt that going to trial would be like reliving the pain of that night all over again, and supported the plea deal, hoping they could finally begin the process of healing. Despite the controversy over the decision, Florida prosecutors accepted the deal, and Paul was handed 7 consecutive life sentences. Though Paul might be in prison for the rest of his life, the scars he left on his family will remain forever. Not only in the loved ones who were taken too soon, but in the family ties that are now permanently severed. Jim and Muriel felt that Paul's father, Michael, shared some of the blame in his son's actions. He had invited Paul over without permission, knowing his history of violence against his family. Whether you believe Paul's parents were culpable in their son's actions is for you to decide, but the Sittons clearly did, and subsequently filed a civil suit against them alleging criminal negligence. This made its way to the courtroom, where a judge ruled that the Merhiges were not criminally liable for Paul's actions and dismissed the case. Neither the Merhiges or the Sittons have spoken to one another in the years since. Paul now sits in a Florida jail, where he will remain until the day he dies. In the 12 years since his crime, all of the victims have tried their best to move on with their lives, but will forever remain haunted by the memories of that fateful Thanksgiving night. This is Crime Spot, and thank you for watching.